This video is going to cover how you create the outline. And on the road to a great speech, there's a couple of different stops that we're going to be making. The first is, what is the outline and how does it break down? So the outline is basically a way in which you're going to organize your information. A lot of times when people approach speech writing, they think they have to sit down and write out word for word what they're going to say. And in fact, that's actually a really terrible way to create a speech. What you want to think of the outline as instead is lots of little post-it notes, right? You have the information there, but it's in an abbreviated form. And the reason that works better is because if you write out your entire speech, the delivery of it is going to be extremely robotic. You want something that has a good flow. So the entire speech is going to break up into multiple post-it notes. The first being the introduction, the second being the body and having subpoints, and the third being the conclusion. So let's start talking about the introduction. The introduction is going to break down to 5 parts. The first is the attention getter, and it's kind of self-explanatory. You want to get the audience's attention. The attention getter is particularly important because it sets the tone for the speech. If you don't start with impact, you lose your audience, so keep that in mind. The thesis, this is the main idea of your speech, and a lot of times students have a tendency to overthink this one. It should just be a sentence basically saying, what is your audience going to learn from your informative speech? Your ethos, this is going to be your character credibility. This is actually something that stems from rhetoric, which I talked about in a couple of videos ago, so I'll talk more about this in a second. The value step, this is telling the audience why they should listen to your speech. And the preview, this is going to be the breakdown. So in a second, we're going to watch an example of what this looks like, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about the attention getter. So this should be a creative and short way to start your speech. What you want to make sure you're doing is, again, like I said, getting the audience's attention. You have to do something so that it introduces the speech, it connects to the topic. Here are a few different suggestions, but really anything you can utilize to get them interested. Next is ethos. So remember, I said this came from rhetoric. This is actually Aristotle's theory. He defines ethos as the character of the speaker. And you'll notice here in part of this definition, he talks about persuasion. Like I mentioned in an earlier video, even though this is informative, to some degree you are persuading the audience because they have to believe you. And the reason they're going to believe you is because you have ethos, right? You have established your character as being credible. So you might be asking, well, how the heck do I establish ethos? Well, there's 2 different ways. The first way is establish a personal, professional, or academic connection. I'll give you a couple of examples. Majoring in nutrition, cleaning up the beaches, having a family full of medical professionals. All of these are different statements that you could put in your speech, obviously if it connected to your specific topic, that would establish your ethos. Now, let's say you have none of these connections. That's fine as well. You can then discuss the research that you've done, right? So having extensively researched all the options for fuel-efficient cars, I can tell you which ones are the best. So you really want to establish to the audience why they should listen to you, and you do that through ethos. The other thing you really want to tell your audience is why they should listen, and you do that through a value step. So remember, going back to the rhetorical situation or the rhetorical triangle, at its heart is the audience. Throughout the entire speech-making process, the audience should be your focus. So you need to answer this question. What can they gain from this speech? And the answer to that question is your value step, right? So what's in it for them? Why is this relevant to them? Or what are they going to get of value from the speech? So let's look at an example, and I'll talk about how each of these steps end up.
Is 5'6" or 5'5" rather. He weighs 150 pounds, has blonde hair, green eyes, an MBA from Harvard, and average work experience. Now let's take a look at applicant B. William Johnson is a 6-foot male, weighing 175 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes, MBA from Stanford, and also average work experience. Now, based on these facts alone, make the quick decision. Which would you hire? Can I get a show of hands for applicant A? Show of hands for applicant B? Right, so by the overwhelming majority, for those of you who chose William Johnson, you're in agreement with numerous hiring boards across across the globe. But do we know why? We can give most credit to the cliche, tall, dark, and handsome. In a 2004 edition of the Journal of Applied Psychology, it was shown by Timothy Judge and Daniel Cagle that on average, a man who is 6 feet tall will earn $5,525 more annually than someone who is 5'6". Now, while this may seem like a small annual difference, in 5 or 6 years, Mr. Johnson will be dreaming of luxuries that Mr. Williamson could never afford. Coming from a family of giants, I've always been aware of the downside of being tall, but after doing some research, I realized that there are many positive benefits, especially in the professional world. And as college students about to go out and face the real world, it's good to know which factors are working for and against you when applying for jobs. So today, I'd like to discuss with you the origins, psychological and societal reasons, and the effects of the high income stereotype. These origins stem from the evolutionary and developmental habits that we form both as an individual and as a species.
Breaking down. So now that we talked about the introduction, let's talk about the body of the speech. So the body of the speech breaks down typically into 3 points. That's what you saw in the introduction of the speech we just watched, and that's very common because odd numbers are typically easier to remember, and the rule of threes, that's why most speeches are that way. But if 2 points works better for you or 4 points works better for you, that's okay. Make sure you just do what works best for the information you have in your speech. You want to use your research and goals for the audience as a guide to do this, and you really need to determine the most effective way to chunk information. So let me talk about what I'm discussing by that. So when we're discussing chunking, I'm not talking about this guy, if there's any Goonies fan, I'm talking about George Miller, who basically discovered that the human brain is really only capable of holding about 4 to 5 pieces of information, a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on the person. But basically, when we think of the human brain, it's only a couple of things that we can really contain in one moment. And the only way that we can contain a lot of this information is if we group it in a way that makes sense, right? We categorize it by things that are similar. So that's really what's important to do. Now that you have all this research, how are you going to organize the speech? So let me give you an example of an effective way to chunk. Let's say your speech is saving money on textbooks. What are different techniques? That might be a question you're asking. Or can you get money for your textbooks? That might be something you want to introduce to your audience. Why do textbooks cost so much? That's definitely a good question. Different kinds of textbooks. So as you have your research, as you ask these questions and continue in the research process, you're going to get a lot of different answers. But really what you're looking for is, what do I want my audience to gain from this? And once you start to get those answers, they're going to break down in this way. So I know, for instance, Amazon is the source you can use. Ebooks are a possibility. Booksmart. Renting books, borrowing books from friends or people who have taken the class before. Personally selling your books and buying books from past students. So I'm going to break this down into 3 categories because, again, that's typically how you break down a speech. What you need to do is take all these things that I have here at the bottom and figure out how can I chunk them effectively. So I know Booksmart, Amazon, ebooks, those are all kind of places that I can go to get books. I know renting books and borrowing books are similar, and I know selling back your books to the bookstore and personally selling your books. These are all kind of ways that I can chunk things. So these really help me now kind of figure out how am I going to break down my speech. So it basically would break down like this, and you'll see right here at the bottom where 1, 2, and 3 are listed, where and how they can buy their books, books being available to rent and borrow, and students can sell their books back to the bookstore. Now, this is actually coming from a student example speech that is on how to save money on textbooks. This example is on my faculty page, so that can also be a guide for you to utilize. Another thing that you want to keep in mind is basically how the speech itself breaks down. So the skeleton of the speech works like this. You need to transition into your point, right, so we know where you're going, introduce the point so we know what the point is, then develop the material, and then round out to end and move on to another point, right? So move, point, development, and I'm going to expand on what that actually is in a second, and then move on from there. So let's talk about that. One of the things that you can obviously add to your points is your research. And of course, by factual source, I mean the same thing, right? The research that you come up with from Google Books, from the database, from Google Scholar, all of those sorts of things are really, really great to put in your speech. However, if you just put in factual sources, you're going to have a terrible speech. It's not going to be interesting, it's not going to be engaging, and it actually may not be that informative because of the fact that it really will not work well to educate your audience. So it's important that you think of sources beyond just the factual. One thing that's really effective in putting in a speech is a non-factual source. Now, I'm terming it non-factual, not because it's not true, but just because it's basically something that works well with factual sources. So, an example, a narrative, a visual, and testimony. In the video that's going to be coming up on engaging the audience and adding interest, I'll be talking a little bit more about these sources, but those are also something you want to start considering. Additional support, so adding to what you currently have, that's also helpful. And then, of course, engaging the audience. Now, when I talk about these sources, a lot of students have the tendency to think of it like you have to put in, okay, factual source, then non-factual, then additional support, then engaging the audience. And in fact, that's not the case. It's not a mathematical formula. I like to think of it as more of a recipe, right? When you make something, you don't make it the same way every single time. There might be a little less salt this time, or you might add a little more cinnamon or something, right? That a chef especially doesn't follow an exact recipe. They utilize what they know is best. And that's really what you have to do for a speech like this. You really have to make sure that you're thinking about what's going to work best. Now, for additional support, you may be wondering, well, what the heck is additional support? This is basically adding your own words to explain the source. So, here's an example of the speech that I mentioned earlier, the one that's on my faculty page. It's a student example. You'll notice this first point right here, he's actually quoting from a textbook. And this is also a really good example of how to cite it in your speech. He's quoting both the book and the author. And then he basically adds his own example, right? If you're concerned about waiting too long for a book in the mail, then consider websites like Chegg, right? So just really adding to what's already being said. If you just have fact, that gets very boring quickly. So again, looking at this is a good example of what additional support is. It's really just adding in your own material to explain what the factual source said. So, how to actually guide you in this process. The speech framer you already have, that's also on my faculty page in case you were absent or you need an additional copy of it, so you can just take that document off of there. Now, you may have already started on this or you may just be in the starting process, but utilize this as a guide. And then the format of outline worksheet. This is actually much more specific. Start on the speech framer first and then use this worksheet, which will guide you through how to actually set up the outline. This you'll be using later on. Right now, just work on the speech framer. Okay, so breaking down a point. Remember again the skeleton like we talked about. A transition, stating the point, the development of the 4 different things we talked about, and then transitioning to your next point. So let's look at an example of how this functions in a speech.
Your role models as people that you look up to. Now that we've taken a look at some of the roots of the stereotype, let's take a look at some of the psychological and societal reasons. Judge notes one important association in relation to academics, and Case and Paxson support this sentiment when they show that as early as age 3, taller children are performing better on cognitive examinations than shorter children. Now, while this trend is slight, it does give reason for why higher-paying jobs are attracting taller job applicants, who are more able to perform the verbal and numerical tasks enabled by their higher intelligence. Subjective notions of beauty also play into the formation of this stereotype. In a study of personal ads, it was shown that 80% of women who mentioned height wanted a man who was 6 feet or taller. Now, this statistic is limited by its relativity. In the Linda Jackson and Kelly Irwin piece in the 1992 Journal of Social Psychology, they showed that while short men like tall women, the converse is often false. We tall women tend to find short men less socially attractive. The final societal input is that of height, dominance, status, and power that this image often creates. Ethos reveals that our personal association of height with power is so deeply ingrained in our minds that we automatically assume that powerful people are big people. There have been numerous studies done in which students are asked to identify the height of a speaker who is introduced by their status, say, student, chief lecturer, professor at a university, and it is shown that the students' predictions of these heights increase as the person's status increases. These findings are important because we're not immune to the way that others view us. In fact, we tend to take on the attributes that society assigns to us. Now let's take a look at.
And when I stopped at the now part, that was when she was actually transitioning into the next point. So remember, you want to start with the transition and end with the transition so your audience knows where you're going. The last part of the speech is one that I think students always neglect. The conclusion is an important part of how you end with impact when you start with impact in the introduction. So sometimes students will say, that's it, nope, I'm done, you're not. Keep in mind, like I said, it's an important opportunity, and there's 3 things you want to do in the introduction and in the conclusion, right? In the introduction, you want to be brief, same thing in the conclusion. You want to be clear, tell your audience what they're supposed to get from the speech. So now that they've listened to the entire thing, what is the takeaway from this? And be memorable. So just like the introduction had an attention getter, this should also have some similar device. It can be, referencing the attention getter you started with, or it can be something completely new, something like a rhetorical question or polling the audience. Again, the same things that I listed for the attention getter apply here, but you do want to end with impact, be very quick about it, and tell them what they were supposed to get from the speech. All right, so that is it. Once you've done all that, you will have completed a very good speech. For homework, you need to answer these questions. What was the preview of the video example? Why is the body of the speech like a recipe? What is chunking? Create an ethos statement, and this is for your specific speech, not for the speech that you saw, but your specific speech topic. Create an ethos statement. And then the last thing that I want you to do is fill out the speech framer. Remember, I gave this out in class. If you need a new one or you weren't in class or didn't get it, remember it is on my faculty page. Just click on links and then click on the one that says speech framer and you'll be able to find it. I want you to fill out everything except for the bottom. So all that's highlighted in yellow right here, the bottom is the non-factual sources. Remember, I'll talk more about that in the next video on adding audience interest.